a lot of the time, the Bible either says very little or nothing at all on quite important issues. I mean, issues like abortion come to mind.
Yep.
But when you talk about the history of sex in Christianity, apart from probably marriage and the position of women, the other big question that always comes up is homosexuality.
Yeah.
And famously, Jesus says nothing about homosexuality. In the Old Testament, we have the passages from Leviticus, which seem to quite harshly condemn homosexuality, at least in a standard English translation. And then again, in the letters of Paul, you have some indications that homosexuality is among the things that should be considered sinful. But again, in your book, this is something you have a lot to say about. So I wondered if you could talk us through that.
Well, yeah, you talk about homosexuality, but this is a very modern idea.
Mm-hmm.
The word was only invented in the mid-19th century. So what we're looking at, if we're looking at any expressions of opinion in Holy Scripture, is a set of different social relationships. You mentioned Leviticus, for instance. Well, if you look carefully at those passages, it's not actually anything but a condemnation of married men indulging in same-sex relations. In Paul, you've got one purple passage so often quoted from the first chapter of Romans, in which a discussion of idolatry suddenly veers off into a condemnation of same-sex relations, actually between women and women and men. That's rather unusual to get the women thrown in. But this is a sort of example of idolatry. The passage actually isn't about same-sex relations. The same-sex relations condemnation is a sort of illustration of a much more basic theme. If you look at the way John Calvin, for instance, commented on this passage, doesn't mention same-sex relations. He sees it's about idolatry, which is something that really interests him.
Yes, this is where Paul says, just for the sake of our listeners, where Paul says, therefore, talking about idolatrous people and saying, therefore he gave them over to their sinful states, and he includes giving up, men giving up natural relations with women and becoming consumed with lust for each other and this kind of thing. So seeming to describe a sort of same-sex behavior, but you're saying that it wasn't interpreted as sort of being about that.
No, it is simply illustrating nasty things that happen once you indulge in idolatry. Word natural is interesting here.
Yes.
It's not in the Hebrew scripture.
Right.
It's coming out of Greek ideas about sex, which can be permissive on the one hand, but they can also be ultra austere, and that's what Paul is picking up. He's a Greek-speaking Jew who, like many Greek-speaking Jews in his generation, has been listening to Greek philosophers, Pythagoras in particular. Pythagoreans are working from Pythagoras' thought long ago. So that's rather specialized, and then there are condemnations, lists of things which are nasty, people who will not get into heaven. And among the people who won't get into heaven, more than once, there is a mention of arsenikoitai and malakoi, two Greek words. We don't really know what arsenikoitai means. It's a very rare Greek word before Paul, so it's probably a slang term in marketplace Greek. Malakoi is a bit more straightforward because it clearly means soft. So what's going on there? Well, two categories of something which probably are about males, and the likelihood is that this is Paul describing something which is a commonplace of Mediterranean society, which is the unequal relationship between an adult male and a teenage boy. This is simply part of Greco-Roman society. The Jews hated it, and therefore it would be natural for someone like Paul to hate it. But that's not exactly homosexuality, because the way in which such a structure works is that it is unequal, and it is part of a lifestyle which will go on to be heterosexual for both parties. This is the way that an adult male organizes his sexual life, and in Greek society it's to educate the younger partner, and the younger partner goes on to be an adult male. So that's what Arsenakoi Kai Malakoi, Arsenakoi Kai Malakoi seems to be about. That's not modern homosexuality, which is basically an equal relationship between people of the same status, and generally, ideally for life. That's a rather different thing. So we're not hearing anything which is particularly relevant to modern society. And then you've already pointed out that Jesus said absolutely nothing about same-sex relations, when he said rather a lot of things, for instance, about hypocrisy. And yet, in the medieval West, hypocrites were not burned at the stake, and same-sex relations did merit you burning at the stake. And this was quite a problem for the medieval church, because in the West, they had evolved a paranoid hatred, let's face it, of same-sex relationships during the 11th and 12th centuries. They called it sodomy. And to find Jesus not saying anything about it is a bit embarrassing, as it is for homophobes at the present day. What are they going to do? Well, they made up a story. You've already alerted us to this happening in Christian history over Adam and Eve. But the story they made up is quite bizarre, and I have to say it took me by surprise when I came across it in my reading. And this is the story of the great Sodomite massacre of Christmas Eve. And the story, by some anonymous cleric of around 1200, is that on Christmas Eve, the first Christmas Eve, as the baby Jesus was about to enter the manger in Bethlehem, he said, I'm not going to go to God the Father. He said, I'm not going to go there. On this earth, I'm not going to save the earth. It is full of sodomites. It's unnatural, and I'm not going to save them. And so God the Father said to him, all right, you're on. I'll massacre the lot. And so he duly did kill every sodomite in the world, and baby Jesus could go down into the manger in Bethlehem. Now, what is this bizarre, horrid story about? It's there in the preaching of friars through the medieval period. You get it casually referred to, for instance, in the writings of mystics, so it's all over the place. What was it about? Well, one friar, a Franciscan friar of the 15th century, Bernardino of Siena, let the cat out of the bag in a sermon. And he said, well, why did Jesus say nothing about same-sex relations? It's because God had killed them all the previous night. So you see what it's about. It is accounting for something which later generations can't find in Scripture and want to.
Why didn't Jesus say anything about homosexuality? Well, because there were no homosexuals.
Exactly. But somehow they came back, but they're noticed.
Yeah.
You don't tend to get this story much in school nativity plays these days.
Yes. I must say that it took me aback too, as you described when I came across this. I love these niche, conspiratorial, strange facets of Christian history. As far as I know, some writers of the time had claimed that it was to be found in the writings of Augustine, for example.
Yeah, the legend classically refers to Jerome and Augustine.
Jerome and Augustine.
And that's how we know it must be a cleric, because these are people who knew about the ancient world.
And we know that.
But actually, you try and match it up with anything that Jerome or Augustine said, it just doesn't fit. And
it's just not there. And I think that can give some instruction as to how to interpret Paul in his writings. You mentioned those two important words, Malachi and Arsenakoitai.
Yeah.
Arsenakoitai probably seeming to be a mixture of arsen, man, and koitai, bed. So something like sort of man bed, which I think is where we get this idea of like men bedding each other.
Yeah.
But I have also heard this discussion also in the context of the Hebrew Bible, that what might be being gotten at here is an unequal sexual relationship of a particular kind. I think the important thing to notice, you talked about the word homosexuality being coined more recently, but the very concept that we might have today of two men in a loving marital relationship versus what we're probably talking about as present in especially the Hebrew Bible, which would not be envisioning such a relationship probably as even possible. They're talking essentially about a particular kind of sex act.
Yeah, but of course you do get it in the Hebrew scripture, classically in the story of David and Jonathan.
Yes.
Which is coming out of the same era as Achilles and Patroclus.
Yes.
These are heroic figures of equal status, and it's remarkable that this story survived in the Hebrew scripture. The passage has lots of linguistic peculiarities, which I think indicates that even then some commentators were embarrassed by it. And that goes into the Syriac version, the Peshitta, as well. And the climax of the particular Jonathan and David story is that they embrace each other and cry, and then, as the King James version puts it, David exceeded. What can this mean? Well, it's very obvious what it means, and you see ancient scriptural commentators wrestling with this.
Yeah.
And then Jerome, of course, has to deal with it, doesn't like sex, and he says, David wept the more. And it's interesting now, looking at evangelical English translation, that they plump for Latin Jerome, who translated the church's scripture into Latin, the Vulgate, and they don't go for the Hebrew scripture, which King James and his translators in 1611 did. I think it's a splendid irony.